The mask techniques in Adobe Camera Raw require us to mask an area to edit first, then move the sliders while viewing the changes we're making. However, there are times when I apply the sliders before the mask. But the question here is, how do we know how far to move those sliders if we can't see the result? In fact, the amount we move those sliders is not that critical, and the key is using a low flow rate from the masking brush we're using. Now, I choose both of these masking options depending on the circumstances. Now, here we have a typical example, I think. We've got highlights right at the top edge, at the top left. We've got a highlight in the central part of the image. So this is a perfect example to use our masking brush, where we apply the sliders first and the brush second. So what I'm going to do here is to go to my mask options, and I'm going to choose a brush. Now, when I select the brush, we can see it shown to us as a series of rings. The inner ring is the hard part of the brush, and between there and the outer ring is the soft part, and that's controlled by the feather on the right hand side. Now, I generally leave that up pretty high. The size of the brush here we can create with this slider, but the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P are much more convenient. The density I leave set at 100, it's the flow that's the important variant here, because we're going to keep this very low. So as I go down to the sliders, if we look at the image, what are we going to affect? Well, we're going to affect the highlights, so let's just bring them down a little bit. We can't see the effect yet. And we're going to affect the exposure, and we're going to bring that down. Now, it's very likely I've moved these sliders a little too far, but the saving grace, as I think I've said, is this low flow rate. Because as I move my brush onto the image and adjust the size accordingly, I can now brush over the areas and just stop when it reaches a density which I'm happy with. And there you can see how easy this is to do. And of course, we're working on a raw file, so even if we do, after working like this, feel that we need to darken it a little more, we can always return to those sliders and drop the exposure down even more. But I think that's more or less going to do the work we need, maybe a little more right along the top edge. But all of these changes are going to be pretty personal as well. Now, with this image, we may be able to employ the same techniques in the base of the image, but just in the center. Now, what I could do here is apply a brush, because I've still got my previous brush here. So if I touch the K key, it's a shortcut to create a new mask, and a new mask has just appeared at the top of the mask window. So now what do we want to achieve? Well, if we look at the tones we're working on, we are probably going to want to darken the shadows a little bit, but I think most importantly again is the exposure. So let me take the exposure down much the same as before. Leaving my flow rate at 13, I can increase the size of the image if it's needed, but now I could just darken down those distractions in the foreground, but without obliterating anything and making the corners even darker than they are. Now, I like the freedom this style of masking allows me, but I suppose we could say that it's better for areas of an image that do not have a defined edge. If we did have a defined edge, then we're more likely to use either Select Subject, Select Sky, or Select Object. With this image of a local beach, I've used exactly the same technique, where I've applied the sliders first and then a brush mask, but here I've used it to enhance those foreground lines, the leading lines that take us into the picture. This method allows us to almost create a path to lead the viewer's eye into the images we're creating.